In the last lecture, we looked at the beginning of God's answer to Habakkuk's second complaint in chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, and saw how chapter 2, verse 4b, the righteous shall live by faith, proved to be very important in Judaism, but clearly is if not the central concept of Christianity. Now, in this lecture, we will look at the balance of God's answer to Habakkuk, chapter 2, verses 5 through 20. First, take a look at chapter 2, verses 5 through 19, which says this: Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol. Like death, he never has enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. Shall not all these take up their taunt against him, with scoffing and riddles for him, and say, Woe to him who heaps up what is not his own? For how long? And loads himself with pledges. Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you trouble? Then you will be spoil for them, because you have plundered many nations. All the remnant of the people shall plunder you, for the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. You have devised shame for your house by cutting off many peoples. You have forfeited your life. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork respond. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that people labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk, in order to gaze at their nakedness. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself, and show your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them. For the blood of man and violence to the earth, to the cities and all who dwell in them. What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it? A metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, Awake, to a silent stone, Arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath in it. Now, in this passage, verse 5 picks up the reference from verse 4a, which had talked about the puffed up person. Verse 4a had said, Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him. Well, verse 5 picks up this reference and then starts expanding upon it, and verse 5 provides the basis for the taunts against him in verse 6 and the 5 woes, verses 6, 9, 12, 15, and 19. Now, in its specific context, the person being spoken of course, is Babylon. But we saw above the descriptions in these verses are general enough to encompass God's judgment against all evildoers, not just Babylon. Well, first, take a look in verse 5. It talks about wine. It's talking about the puffed up person. Then it says, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who's never at rest. That seems out of place, but actually it's very appropriate in this context. In a parallel prophecy, Jeremiah 51, verse 7, compared Babylon to wine. Jeremiah said, Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hand, making all the earth drunken. The nations drank of her wine, therefore the nations went mad. The Bible frequently compares wine, or uses wine as a metaphor of God's judgment. And it does this all the way from the Psalms to the prophets to the book of Revelation. Now, since God was here using Babylon to judge Judah, wine is an excellent metaphor here. But this section is also telling us that God is going to judge Babylon. Because the beginning of verse 5 characterizes Babylon basically as drunk with his own power. In verses 15 and 16, the metaphor of drinking for God's judgment again is used. And they say, verses 15 and 16, "Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory." Again, this is another example of God saying, remember, Habakkuk's first complaint was, why do you let all this evil and injustice happen? Why are you silent? Don't you see? Well, God again is saying, I will judge and repay them according to their deeds. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. What a person or a nation sows, that will it reap. By its own standard, it will be measured out back to them. And so, just as Judah was unfaithful, was unjust and oppressive, God was using the Babylonians, who themselves are unfaithful, unjust, and oppressive, to judge Judah. But then because Babylon is unfaithful, unjust, and oppressive, it too will be destroyed. And it's interesting when it talks about the cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon you. It's fascinating, I think, in what God is saying here, that happened literally, because you may recall from the book of Daniel, Daniel was in Babylon, and Babylon was overthrown when its king and his leaders and concubines were drinking out of the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. And Daniel spoke to King Belshazzar and saying, "You have lifted up yourselves against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought before you, and your lords, your wives, your concubines have drunk wine from them. You've praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which neither see nor hear. But the God in whose hands is your breath and whose are all your ways, you have not honored." In other words, what happened to Babylon is the wine metaphor was applied literally, and Daniel talked about the wine, talked about the vessel from the Lord's right hand, from the temple, and accused Babylon of idolatry, which is exactly what God is saying here in Habakkuk 2, verses 18 and 19, where it talks about the idols who can neither see nor hear. So all of these things were fulfilled literally against Babylon after Habakkuk wrote this. But what's also, I think, very interesting is it says that God, when it talks about drink yourself, show your uncircumcision, the cup in the Lord's right hand will come around, and utter shame come upon your glory. What he's saying is that the Babylonians, and all people, we seek our own glory, but you're only going to receive shame from it. It was through Jesus Christ that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. But remember, it was Christ who did not seek his own glory. He did not account equality with God to be grasped, but he emptied himself. And then it says in Hebrews, it was Christ, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame. In other words, he did not seek his own glory. He received nothing but shame. But as a result, he is glorified. The Babylonians, the Judeans, and most all people, we seek our own glory, but God says, no, you will receive shame instead. And so again, as Christ said, whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. It's a reversal of the values of the world compared to the values of God. God was using the Babylonians to teach the Judeans this. He then judges the Babylonians, and he pays back by their own standard. God is fair. He is just. His timing is often not the way we wish it would be, but God waits because he's merciful. Now, let's take a look at the woe oracles in verses 6 through 19. Woe is typically used by the prophets to indicate a judicial indictment. Jesus used the same kind of language when condemning lack of repentance and lack of belief, when condemning hypocrisy and those who hinder others from coming to faith. Now, in these verses that talk about people and nations, the earth, humanity, the sea, and so on, it's presupposing an international situation. And so again, the principles that Habakkuk is talking about are general enough that they extend far beyond Judah and Babylon. But remember, in God's first response, back in chapter 1, God used the very same words that Habakkuk had used to show that, yes, I hear you, and I'm specifically answering you. He does the same thing now. In the first woe, in chapter 2, verse 6, it says, "Woe to him who heaps up what is not his own. For how long? And loads himself with pledges." Remember, Habakkuk's initial complaint was, "How long, O Lord?" Well, now God is using the same language, only ironically. He's mocking the nations, turning it on their head, saying, "You heap up all these things for yourself, but for how long? How long is it going to last?" Like Asaph said in Psalm 73, why do the unrighteous prosper? But then I saw their end. They can prosper, live a life, be 100 years old. But that's nothing compared to eternity. The end is coming, and it's coming soon. And again, in verses 7 and 8 here in Habakkuk 2, it says, "Will not your debtors arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoil for them, because you have plundered many nations. They will plunder you." And that's exactly what happened to Babylon. It fell to its former victims, its debtors, the Medes and the Persians. So again, when it says, "You have plundered many nations, and all the remnant of the people will plunder you," that's another example of God applying the principle, what you have sown, so shall you reap. Again, God is saying this. He is fair. Nothing is overlooked. He is a God of justice. Now, verse 14, another crucial verse. We saw that chapter 2, verse 4b, key verse, "The righteous shall live by faith." Verse 14, God states his purpose in behind the woes of judgment. He says, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." So in other words, the whole world, its length, its breadth, its depth, will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God. And the centrality of the glory of the Lord is seen throughout the Bible. Isaiah says that God created us for his glory. He chose, in Ephesians, he chose his people for his glory. Jesus suffered and died for the glory of God. Jesus receives us into fellowship with him for the glory of God. Everything we do is to be for the glory of God. And in the New Jerusalem, the glory of God replaces the sun. And so, in other words, it's also interesting. In the Masoretic text, in chapter 4, verse 14, we've already said how the glory of the Lord, that comes through Jesus Christ. Through people receiving Christ, we are spreading his glory as we come into his kingdom, and we build his kingdom out of every tribe, tongue, nation, and people in the world. But so the knowledge of the glory of the Lord filling the world as the waters of the sea that reveals ultimately an eschatological purpose, which is further indicated in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was completed over 100 years before Christ came to earth. In chapter 2, verse 3, where it says, "Still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay." Now, the Septuagint changes the last portion of that verse, not to say that it will come. It reads, though he should tarry, wait for him, for he will surely come and will not tarry. In other words, the vision is not, it's not just the vision that will come, but the deliverer will surely come. That clearly gives a messianic connotation. And because in the New Testament, he who is coming is applied to Jesus, the Messiah. So again, what we are seeing here is that Jesus is behind this. He is the ultimate fulfillment of the vision, and that is even indicated in the Septuagint's translation of chapter 2, verse 3 concerning the vision. Now, I mentioned verses 18 and 19 are the other side of the coin. God's ultimate purpose is to fill the earth with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. But the other side of the coin of his judgment is verses 18 and 19. The reason why God has pronounced the woes and is bringing judgment, the root of all the greed, violence, and oppression and injustice against which the woes are pronounced is idolatry. Because verses 18 and 19, what profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver. There's no breath in it. That's idolatry. Yet the passage began in verse 5 by talking about the Babylonians' arrogance and their insatiable greed. Verse 5, his greed is as an arrogant man is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol. Now, arrogance amounts to self-deification, which is idolatry. And greed is explicitly defined to be idolatry in Ephesians 5, verse 5, and Colossians 3, verse 5. So, in God's answer here, from beginning to end, the source of the evil is idolatry. It's idolatry characterized the Chaldeans, but idolatry is far broader and deeper than that. Because you look at, we know from Old Testament history, the Jews, the Judeans themselves, they raised up idols and so on. You look at different books of the Bible that accuses them of infidelity. God accuses them of infidelity, going after other gods and so on. They're idolaters. But the problem is, and in fact, various prophecies use the same kind of language. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel compared both Judah and Babylon to Sodom and Gomorrah. So they are equivalent in God's eyes. And in fact, remember, Judah, Israel, they had the covenants. They had the word of God. If anything, they're held to a higher standard. And remember, the same applies to us. Judgment begins in the household of God. Why am I saying that in discussing idolatry? Because idolatry is not just one sin among many. It, I think we will see, is the root of all sin. What do I mean? Look at the 10 Commandments. The very first commandment, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods by me, except me. In other words, no idols. Second one, you'll make no graven images. Okay? First two commands, all against idolatry. And Martin Luther recognized this when he said, if you violate any of the other commandments, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, and so on, you're also violating the first commandment against idolatry. Why? Because idolatry, an idol, is elevating anything or anyone over God. And so if you steal something, at that moment you're elevating your desire for that thing over faithfulness to God. If you commit adultery, you're putting that person and your sexual pleasure over your faithfulness to God. In other words, you're committing idolatry as well as thievery, as well as adultery. And we all tend to do this. We all put things, our ultimate idols are ourselves. We want, what do I want? For my life to be safe and secure and healthy and wealthy and all of these things. We're putting our own well-being over God's. Timothy Keller puts it like this. According to the Bible, the primary way to define sin is not just doing bad things, but the making of good things into ultimate things. It is seeking to establish a sense of self by making something else more central to your significance, purpose, and happiness than your relationship to God. So what Luther and Keller are saying implicates Habakkuk himself and us. None of us is above the accusation of idolatry because we all tend to make good things into ultimate things. It could be success, money, our families, all kinds of things above our love, trust, obedience, and devotion to God. That's all idolatry. And Ezekiel indicated this in Ezekiel 14, where he speaks of idols in the heart. In other words, idolatry is first and foremost an internal problem in our own hearts, in the worship of ourselves and of other things. All of the violence, injustice, oppression, and all the other sins that Habakkuk was concerned about are simply the outward visible signs of an inward spiritual problem of idolatry and failure to love and be devoted to God. That's why Jesus said, it's not what goes into you that defiles you, but it's what comes out of you, out of your heart. So again, the Bible does not consider idolatry just to be one sin among many and only found among primitive people who worship statues. No. All of our failures to trust God wholly and to live rightly are at root idolatry, something we make more important than God. There's always a reason for a sin, and under our sins are idolatrous desires. Idolatry is a universal problem, and that is why this book is talking about universal principles. It's not limited just to ancient Judah and Babylon. So, to summarize, in answer to Habakkuk's complaints, God is saying, first, because of Judah's own sin, it will punish Judah by raising up a foreign power, just as Moses warned them would happen in Deuteronomy. Secondly, God is saying, I didn't break the covenant, but you have not been righteous. You have not lived by faith, as Habakkuk said in chapter 2, verse 4b. It is you who broke the covenant, and therefore I am just and proper in administering justice in condemning you. Third, since the Chaldeans are indeed less righteous than Judah, they would be judged and punished for their sins and evil as well. What they have sown, they also shall reap. In other words, God is equitable and fair in dealing with individuals and nations, which leads to the end of chapter 2, verse 20. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Now that word but is important. It draws a contrast with the events taking place on the earth, which he has depicted in verses 5 through 19. It's telling Habakkuk that despite what you may see occurring in the world, in your country, God is still on the throne. He is sovereignly ruling the world. He's testing the righteous and the wicked. God has a plan. He is implementing that plan. God knows the end from the beginning, and as he says in Isaiah 46, I will accomplish all my purpose. And one day, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Now, God has already said that the vision awaits its appointed time. Wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. And so he's giving us assurance here that the wicked will not ultimately prosper. Tyranny will fail, and idols will be revealed as nothing. God's justice will be made apparent. But Habakkuk and we must accept that. We need to accept this by faith. That's why in the Bible, in the New Testament, it says, we walk by faith, not by sight. And so again, these same things apply to us when we look at our own lives, when we look at our countries, when we look at the world. God has promised us. He's promised us here in Habakkuk that one day, through Christ, the entire earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. It will come. And so God's justice will prevail. Therefore, because we know that God is trustworthy, he proved that on the cross, we can hold fast to what we know is true of God, and we can look at our circumstances through the lens of the cross and the resurrection. We need to keep that front and center. Don't see everything through the bad circumstances of your life or what's going on in your country or in the world. No, we need to put that in proper perspective by having the glasses, so to say, of the cross and the resurrection, because they are both anchored in God's love for us. And so we can humbly wait upon the Lord, trusting him, being faithful to him, working out our own salvation in fear and trembling, because we know it's God who's working in us both to will and to do, and demonstrating our faith by our life. And so when it says in verse 20, so let all the earth keep silence before him. In other words, don't dictate to him. See what he's doing. Ask what he's doing. Remember, he's God. You're not. I'm not. Learn from him. That lesson was brought home to Job. Remember, Job said, I would like to ask God a few questions. Why are you doing this? And blah, 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 blah. Well, then God spoke to him and showed him, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? What do you know about this? And at the end, God questioned him, and Job said, I know you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. That's a hard lesson. None of us wants to do that. We all think we know. And I'm speaking for myself here, that, we all think we have the answers. We are not happy with a lot of what's going on. We don't understand a lot of what's going on. Well, we need to remember that. We don't understand a lot of what's going on. We don't have the breadth or the depth of vision that God has. He has not revealed to us. The secret things belong to him. But we can trust him. We remain faithful to him, given the light that we have, and trust that all things will work, the good, the bad, and the ugly. They eventually will work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Now, in the next lecture, we will begin with chapter 3, which is Habakkuk's prayer in the form of a psalm, in which we will see how his perspective is changed by these dialogues that he has had with God and by the vision that he has of God's righteousness, holiness, sovereignty, and power.